In this example, we want to look to see what happens to the market when we tax the consumer. So think of this as similar to a sales tax, that's a tax in a sense on the consumer, and other taxes can follow suit. So here we have our supply and demand. So if we find equilibrium, here is Q star, we come over here, here is P star. All right, now when we put a tax on the supplier, we shift the supply curve up, but this is going to be different, is we're taxing the consumer, so it's going to cause the demand curve to shift down. And it'll shift down to the size of the tax. So if the tax is this much here, then the demand curve will shift accordingly. And here's our new demand curve, where this vertical distance between the curves is the size of the tax. And now to find our optimal quantity, we identify where the new demand curve touches the old supply curve. And bring that line down. So here is Q tau, or Q with the tax. That's the optimal quantity with the tax. We now find different prices. So where this point is, this is the price that the seller receives. And one thing is, you might think, well, how do I know which is the price of the seller, which is the buyer? The price of the buyer is always going to be higher because the buyer has to pay both the price to the seller and the tax amount. So this is the amount, the price that the seller receives. And at that quantity, this is the price, or you take that price and you add the tax. So this is the price that the buyer pays. So under a tax on the consumer, the demand curve shifts down. We take the new demand curve and identify that point on the original supply curve. That identifies our quantity. Put that quantity into our original supply curve. That gives us the price to the seller. We can then just take that price and add the tax, because this distance here is that vertical distance. So that's the tax. Or I can take this quantity and put it into the original demand equation, and that will then tell me the price to the buyer. Now to identify the points on the graph is the demand curve all the way down to the price to the buyer. This triangle here is consumer surplus. The price to the seller all the way to the supply curve. This is producer surplus. The quantity sold times the size of the tax. This rectangle here, this is tax revenue. And notice that some of it's going to be coming, this amount here is really the spot placed, or the burden placed on the consumer, because that's how much their price went up. And this part of that rectangle is the difference in price received by the seller. Notice they're not always the same. Sometimes the burden falls more heavily on the consumer or the producer. And now we're left with just this last triangle. And it's the difference in prices, or the size of the tax, times the change in quantity. And this triangle is our dead weight loss. And so now we can identify each parts of the graph, and we can see as a result of the tax on a consumer that the quantity will go down, the price that the buyers pay will increase, the price that the sellers receive will decrease, consumer surplus will decrease, producer surplus will decrease, and it will create a tax revenue which the government can use to either give to consumers, give to producers, or do other things with. And it also creates deadweight loss, meaning that now we've reduced our total efficiency.